There is a mystery, hidden from the foundation of the world, concealed in the depths of the Scriptures, waiting to be revealed to those who will seek it. It is the mystery of the glory, the radiance of the Almighty, the presence that transforms, that empowers, that changes everything. The glory of God is not just an abstract concept, nor is it merely a theological idea. It is a reality more powerful than anything in the natural realm. The glory is the very presence of God, the radiance of His being, the fullness of His Spirit. It is the light that surrounded Adam in the garden, the fire that led Israel through the wilderness, the cloud that descended upon Mount Sinai. It is the weight of God's presence, the substance of His majesty, and the revelation of who He is. Yet though man was created to dwell in that glory, something happened that changed everything. The access that once was open became closed. The presence that once surrounded man became distant. The glory that was meant to fill his life was lost, and this loss changed the course of human history. In the beginning, man did not just know about God, he walked with Him. He lived in His presence. He was clothed in His light. But when sin entered, something more than just a legal guilt came upon man. Something deeper took place. The connection between man and the presence of God was severed. The moment Adam and Eve took of the forbidden fruit, their eyes were opened, but what they saw was not what they expected. They saw their own nakedness. Why? Because before that moment they had been covered in something greater than garments. They had been covered in the very radiance of God. The glory was their clothing, their covering, their identity. And when they fell, the glory departed. They tried to cover themselves with fig leaves, but nothing on earth could replace what had been lost. From that moment on, all of humanity would seek to fill the void left by the absence of glory. It is the reason why the world chases after fame, power, wealth, and pleasure. It is why man seeks to exalt himself, to be seen, to be admired, to be praised, because deep within there is an ancient memory of what it was like to be clothed in something greater. There is a longing to regain what was lost, but the world's versions of glory are nothing more than counterfeits. The applause of men fades, riches perish, power crumbles, and beauty withers away. What was lost in the garden was not earthly, it was heavenly, and what was lost can never be replaced by anything of this world. But here is the mystery. Though man lost his access to the glory, God never abandoned His desire to dwell with His creation. He never ceased to make a way for His presence to return. He revealed glimpses of His glory to those who sought Him. He called Abraham out from the land of idols and led him to a place where His presence would be known. He met with Moses in the burning bush and revealed His divine name. He led His people by a pillar of fire and a cloud of His presence. He descended upon Mount Sinai, and the earth trembled at the weight of His glory. When Moses stood on that mountain, he cried out, "Show me your glory." And God answered, revealing His goodness, His mercy, and His name. But even then, Moses could only see a glimpse, because the fullness of the glory had not yet been restored. The pattern continued with the tabernacle. God commanded Moses to build a dwelling place, a tent where His presence would come. And when it was completed, the glory descended. The presence of God filled the Holy of Holies. Later, in the days of Solomon, the glory filled the temple in such a way that the priests could not understand. It was the return of what had been lost. But even then, the access was limited. Only one man, the high priest, could enter the Holy of Holies, and only once a year. The door was not yet fully opened. The separation remained. The fullness of the glory had not yet come. But every time the glory appeared, it was a sign. It was a foreshadowing. It was pointing to something greater. The presence of God was never meant to dwell in a tent or a building made of stone. It was meant to dwell in His people, What was lost in the garden was not just the presence of God. It was the presence of God within man. And so, the prophet spoke of a day when the glory would return, not just to a temple, but to human hearts. They spoke of a time when the presence of God would no longer be distant, but near, when the Spirit of God would be poured out, and His people would once again walk in His light. And then, at the appointed time, the glory came. But it did not come in the form of fire or smoke. It did not descend upon a mountain or a temple. It came in the form of a child born in a manger. The very radiance of God took on flesh and dwelt among us. The one who was, from the beginning, clothed in eternal light, now walked among fallen man. He was the fullness of the glory in human form. And He came for one purpose, to restore what was lost, to open the way, to tear the veil. to bring man back into the presence of God, to unlock the access to the glory. There is a mystery woven throughout the scriptures, or hidden in the ancient paths, waiting to be discovered by those who have eyes to see and ears to hear. The key to unlocking the glory is not found in the wisdom of this world, nor in human effort, nor in striving. It is embedded within the very patterns of God, the divine blueprints laid out since the beginning of time. These patterns are not arbitrary. They are the fingerprints of the Almighty, revealing His ways, His order, and His purposes. Those who walk in alignment with these ancient paths walk in the flow of His presence. Those who understand His appointed times, His ordained cycles, and His divine principles are those who position themselves to receive the fullness of the glory. When God created the heavens and the earth, He set everything in motion according to a pattern. The sun, the moon, and the stars move in precise order. The tides rise and fall in appointed times. The seasons change according to His decree. Nothing is random. Everything operates in harmony with His divine design. And just as there are physical laws that govern the universe, there are spiritual laws that govern His presence. The glory is not accessed by accident. It follows a pattern. It follows the order that God established from the foundation of the world. When the Israelites were in bondage in Egypt, they had no access to the glory. They were surrounded by darkness, enslaved by the systems of this world. But God revealed a pattern, a divine strategy for deliverance. He established the Passover, a prophetic shadow of redemption, a key hidden in time. Only those who followed the pattern, those who placed the blood of the Lamb upon their doorposts, were spared. It was not their own efforts that saved them. It was their obedience to the divine order. The pattern was given, and those who aligned with it walked in the blessing. When they arrived at Mount Sinai, God gave them another revelation, the pattern of His dwelling place. The tabernacle was not built according to human imagination. It was constructed according to the blueprint given by God. Every detail, every measurement, every material was specified by the Almighty. And when the pattern was followed, the glory came. The presence of God filled the tabernacle, a sign that His ways had been honored. Later, Solomon built the temple, and again the same truth was revealed. When the divine order was established, when the pattern was followed, the glory descended in such power that the priests could not even stand to minister. Throughout the scriptures, the pattern continues. The feasts of the Lord are not random celebrations. They are appointed times, divine keys that unlock the mysteries of His presence. The Sabbath is not just a day of rest. It is a shadow of something greater, a picture of entering into the presence of God. The cycles of 7, the Sabbath, the Shemitah, the Jubilee are all part of the divine pattern. Those who walk in the ways of God walk in the flow of His presence. Those who break the pattern find themselves outside the blessing. Even the life of the Messiah followed the ancient blueprint. He was born in the appointed time, entered Jerusalem at the appointed time, was crucified at the appointed time, and rose again in perfect alignment with the feasts of the Lord. Nothing was random. Everything was according to the pattern. When He walked upon the earth, He did not operate outside of God's order. He walked in perfect harmony with the ways of the Father. And because He walked in alignment, He walked in the fullness of the glory. And yet, even though He was the fullness of the presence of God, He did not keep the glory for Himself. He came to restore the pattern to those who had lost it. He came to open the way for man to once again walk in the divine order. He taught in parables, revealing the secrets of the kingdom to those who were willing to hear. He demonstrated the power of alignment by healing the sick, casting out demons, and raising the dead. Every miracle He performed was not just an act of compassion. It was a glimpse into what happens when the order of God is restored. When He was crucified, the veil of the temple was torn. It was the ultimate sign that the separation between man and the glory had been removed. But even in His death, the pattern continued. He rested in the grave on the Sabbath, just as God rested on the seventh day. And on the third day, according to the ancient prophecy, He rose again. The resurrection was not just a victory over death. It was a revelation that the pattern had been fulfilled, that the access to the glory had been restored. Yet, the mystery does not end there. For the glory to be accessed, the pattern must still be followed. The early believers understood this. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to prayer, to breaking bread together. They lived in the rhythm of God's presence, and the power of the Spirit moved among them. Miracles were common. Boldness filled their hearts. The presence of God was tangible. They had unlocked the access to the glory because they walked in the divine order. But as time went on, the pattern was forgotten. The cycles were ignored. The ways of the world crept in, and the power that once marked the people of God began to fade. Yet, the key has never changed. The mystery remains hidden in the ancient paths, waiting to be rediscovered. The presence of God still moves in accordance with His order. The access to the glory is not about striving, nor about religious effort, but about alignment. When the pattern is restored, the presence returns. When the divine order is honored, the glory descends. The presence of God is not random. The move of His Spirit is not unpredictable. There is a pattern, a principle, a divine alignment that determines whether the glory of God manifests in a person's life or remains distant. Throughout history, those who have experienced the fullness of His presence were not those who merely desired it, but those who aligned themselves with His ways. Alignment is the key that opens the doors of heaven. It is the principle that governs access to the power, the anointing, and the supernatural. When a person, a people, or a nation aligns with the order of God, the heavens open. When they depart from it, the heavens close. The power of alignment is one of the most critical spiritual laws in existence, and yet many do not even realize it. The seasons change according to His decree. Everything in the natural world operates according to the order that He set in place. And just as there are physical laws that govern the universe, there are spiritual laws that govern the presence of God. The glory of God does not move haphazardly. It moves in response to alignment. When a person aligns their life with the will of God, they step into the flow of His power. When they step out of that alignment, they remove themselves from the fullness of His presence. Throughout Scripture, this principle is revealed. When the children of Israel walked in obedience to the commands of God, the blessings of heaven poured out upon them. Their enemies were defeated before them. Their land flourished. They walked in divine protection, but when they turned away, the opposite happened. They struggled, they suffered, and the presence of God lifted. It was not because God had changed. It was because they had moved out of alignment with His ways. The presence of God is always connected to His order. The Spirit of God moves where He is welcomed, where He is honored, where His ways are followed. When the Ark of the Covenant was taken by the Philistines, Israel mourned because they knew the presence had departed. But the presence did not return simply because they desired it. It returned when they followed the divine instructions to bring it back in the proper way. When David attempted to move the ark on a cart, instead of carrying it on the shoulders of the priests as commanded, tragedy struck. A man reached out to steady the ark and was struck down. It was not because God did not want His presence among His people. It was because His presence moves in accordance with His divine order. When David later aligned with the right pattern, bringing the ark back as God had commanded, the glory returned to Jerusalem, and the people rejoiced. The power of alignment was seen in the life of the prophets. Elijah stood before the people of Israel on Mount Carmel and challenged them with a question. How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow Him. The people had fallen out of alignment. They wanted the blessings of God while still holding on to the idols of Baal. But Elijah knew the principle. The power of God would not be revealed until the people aligned themselves with Him again. And so, he rebuilt the altar. He restored what had been broken. He placed the sacrifice in order. And when everything was aligned, the fire of God fell. The presence of God was revealed, and the people fell on their faces in repentance. The fire did not fall simply because they wanted it to. It fell because the order was restored. The same pattern was seen in the ministry of Jesus. The sick were healed, the blind received sight, the dead were raised. But there were places where even He could do no mighty works. In His hometown, where the people refused to receive Him, the power was hindered. It was not that Jesus had changed. It was that the people had not aligned themselves with faith. The presence of God moves where there is faith, where there is honor, where there is alignment with the Spirit. When Jesus taught His disciples to pray, He gave them the key to alignment. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The power of alignment is bringing the will of God in heaven into the reality of earth. It is positioning oneself under His rule, His authority, His ways. It is no longer living according to the patterns of the world, but living according to the patterns of the kingdom. When a person aligns with the ways of God, they step into the authority of the kingdom. The supernatural becomes natural. The impossible becomes possible. The glory becomes accessible. The outpouring of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost came not just because the disciples were waiting, but because they were in one accord. They were in unity, in prayer, in alignment with the command of Jesus to tarry in Jerusalem. And because they aligned with His word, the heavens opened, and the Spirit was poured out in power. The early church walked in the power of God because they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and to prayer. They lived in alignment with the ways of the kingdom, and as a result, signs and wonders followed them. But as time went on, many departed from the divine order. The church moved away from the patterns of the kingdom and adopted the ways of the world. The power that once flowed so freely became scarce. The presence that once shook cities and transformed nations became a distant memory. But the principle has never changed. The presence of God still moves in accordance with alignment. Those who walk in obedience to His ways still experience the fullness of His Spirit. Those who build their lives upon His word still walk in His power. Those who align with the order of the kingdom still unlock the access to the glory. For the glory of God is not something to be observed from a distance. It is not merely an event or an encounter that happens once and then fades away. The purpose of the glory is not just to be seen, but to be carried. From the very beginning, God's desire was not just to reveal His presence, but to dwell among His people, to fill them, to make them vessels of His glory. When the presence of God comes, it is not meant to be an external visitation, but an indwelling reality. The access to the glory is not just about receiving it for a moment, but about becoming a carrier of the presence of God, a vessel through whom His power and radiance flow continuously. This mystery is woven throughout the Scriptures. When God called Abraham, He did not simply bless him. He made him a conduit of blessing. He told him that through him, all nations would be blessed. The pattern of God's presence has never been about mere personal experience, but about transformation and transmission. Those who are touched by the presence of God are meant to carry it into the world. The glory is not just for those who receive it, but for those who become vessels through which it is released. Moses encountered the glory on Mount Sinai, but when he descended, the radiance of God was not just something he had seen, it was something that had marked him. His face shone with the light of God, to the point that the people could not even look upon him. The encounter did not leave him the same. He did not just receive revelation, he carried the evidence of the presence. And yet even that was temporary. Over time, the radiance faded because the covenant he carried was not yet the fulfillment of what God had intended. It was a foreshadowing, a sign of something greater to come. When the glory filled the tabernacle, it was a sign that God desired to dwell among His people. When the glory filled the temple in the days of Solomon, it was a confirmation that God was establishing His dwelling place on earth. But even then, it was incomplete. The glory filled a building, but the ultimate plan of God was never to dwell in a temple made by human hands. The true dwelling place of God was always meant to be within His people. The prophets spoke of a time when the Spirit of God would not merely visit, but would inhabit His people. Ezekiel saw a vision of a new temple, one where the presence of God would flow like a river, bringing life wherever it went. Joel prophesied of a day when God would pour out His Spirit on all flesh, when the presence would no longer be confined to a physical structure, but would be released into the lives of His people. Then, at the appointed time, the fulfillment came. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The presence of God was no longer hidden behind a veil, no longer contained within stone walls, no longer distant. The fullness of the glory came in human form. And yet the plan was not just for the glory to be among men, but for it to be within them. The separation between God and man was removed. The access to the glory was restored, but the mystery was not complete until the day of Pentecost, when the Spirit of God came like a rushing wind and filled the believers. The glory that once dwelled in the tabernacle now dwelled in them. The fire that once fell upon the altar now rested upon their heads. The presence that once required a high priest to enter now flowed through fishermen, tax collectors, and ordinary men and women. The temple of stone was replaced by the temple of living stones. The people of God had become the dwelling place of his presence. From that moment, the world was never the same. Those who carried the presence of God walked in power, healed the sick, cast out demons, raised the dead, and turned cities upside down. They did not just preach about the presence of God, they manifested it. They did not just talk about the kingdom, they demonstrated it. They were not just recipients of the glory, they were carriers of it. The presence of God was no longer a concept, no longer a story of the past, no longer something to be sought in a distant place. It was within them, moving through them, transforming everything around them. Yet as time passed, many lost sight of this reality. The church became more focused on experiencing moments of God's presence rather than living as vessels of his glory. People began to seek encounters instead of transformation, blessings instead of purpose, visitation instead of habitation. But the access to the glory has never been about a temporary event. It has always been about becoming a living temple. The presence of God is not meant to be a fleeting experience, but a continual indwelling. Those who walk in this reality do not wait for the fire to fall. They carry the fire wherever they go. They do not seek revival. They become revival. They do not ask for the presence to come. They release the presence that is already within them. The call is not just to receive, but to become. The world does not need more people who talk about God. It needs people who walk in the reality of his presence. It needs those who do not just believe in miracles, but through whom miracles happen. It needs those who do not just hope for transformation, but who manifest the kingdom in their daily lives. The true evidence of access to the glory is not in what is experienced, but in what is carried. The presence of God is not meant to be locked inside a church building, confined to a service, or contained within a moment of worship. It is meant to invade the streets, the homes, the workplaces, the nations. Those who truly access the glory do not leave it behind when they walk out of a service. They carry it into the world because the glory is not something to visit. It is something to live in.